This is a demonstration on how to do the first step of the color wheel painting project. We're going to do the outer ring of pure hues today. And I'm going to start out by tracing my color wheel onto a sheet of Bristol. So the easiest way to do that is if you're able to print out one of the templates that I uploaded on Canvas, then you can just trace it by holding it up to a window, or if you have a light box, you can use one of those. The other way is to sort of just freehand draw it. If you do it that way, I recommend making the diameter of the wheel about 8 inches, somewhere between 7 and 8 inches is great. That'll give you enough space to work with your brushes within there. So I traced this one. I used a light graphite pencil, and I want to make sure that these lines don't show through when I'm painting. So before I start, I'm just going to take my eraser and lighten them a little bit. So I'm erasing just so I can still see them, but they won't show through the paint. Now I'm going to start out by painting the primary hues. So I'm going to start out by painting yellow, red, and blue. And on your assignment, you will see that I've listed which pigments you should mix for each of those. So none of them is going to be a color straight out of the tube. They're all going to be mixed. And each color that you fill in the pure hues ring is going to use 2 colors to mix it, and no more than 2. So none of them are going to have 1, none of them are going to have 3 or 4. All are just going to be a mixture of 2 different colors, and each one is listed on the assignments. So for yellow, I'm going to be mixing my 2 yellows together until I find the color that I think approximates a primary yellow, which is sort of like the perfect ideal yellow. So I'm going to squeeze a little bit of each of my yellows. So for each one of these primaries, I have kind of a warmer and a cooler version of it. So the warm yellow is brilliant yellow, and the cooler yellow is called cadmium lemon. Don't be afraid to use quite a bit of paint, because I promise you won't run out. So I'm going to mix just little bits of these together until I get what I think is a perfect yellow, and it's not going to be 50% of each. Now when I'm happy with that mixture, I'm going to use my palette knife to mix the colors rather than a brush, because you'll get a nice consistent color and also texture of the paint. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to choose a brush. If the paint consistency feels pretty fluid, then you can stick with it as it is. If it feels like it needs to be a little more fluid, you can add a little bit of water to thin it out. You want to try to make the colors as opaque as possible, and sometimes that might take more than one coat. So this will all take a little bit of practice. That's one of the main purposes of this assignment, is to learn how to mix the paint and also get used to the handling of it. So you can see why I erased some of the lines, because it's a little, this color is a little bit light, and you would probably be able to see the pencil through if I hadn't lightened those lines a bit. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to save this in case I need to do another coat on there, and I'm going to wait until it dries. So gouache is essentially opaque watercolor, and it can reactivate, meaning that if you add water to it, it'll sort of lift itself off of the paper. When you're painting on this style of smooth paper, like Bristol, it accepts the paint really well, but if you put too many layers, it can sort of develop some weird textures. And again, you'll figure that out as you go along, but it tends to layer better if you let the first layer dry completely. So I did yellow. Next I'm going to move on to the next primary, which is going to be red. So if I look over here, I have yellow at the top, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 steps away is red. So I'm going to clean my brush. I like this brush for filling in these shapes, so I'm going to keep using the same one. I'm going to move on to red. Now I have two reds here, also a warmer red and a cooler red. The warm red is called Flame Red and the cooler red is called Rose Tyrian. In this case, I feel like the Flame Red is closer to a primary red than the rose, so I'm gonna start out with a larger quantity of the Flame Red and add a little bit of Rose Tyrian to it. So these color mixtures are a little subjective. You'll get a chance after you submit this assignment to have your peers give you some feedback as well, so that we can kind of come to a group consensus about what looks closest to a good primary color. I think that actually looks pretty good. Some of the colors that you mix will be more transparent than others, so just do your best to make them consistent when you're painting them on the paper. 1, 2, 3, 4. Alright, there's my red. Again, I'm going to save that in case I need to do another coat. And my brush, and my knife. Now I'm going to move on to my third primary color, which is blue. I'm going to take my warm blue, which is called turquoise blue, my cool blue, which is called ultramarine, mix those two together until I get the perfect primary blue, so I think it's probably going to be more ultramarine. Looks pretty good. Now you can see these three primaries are equidistant from each other on the color wheel. This one's a little bit more transparent than the other two so far, so I might need to do a second coat. Now I have the primaries finished. I'm going to move on to the secondary and tertiary colors. So those also are going to have only two colors mixed together, but they're going to be two directly from the tubes and not these that are mixed. Because if I mixed, for example, this yellow and this red, I would get an orange, but it would be an orange that was made out of 4 colors, and it's going to turn out to be less saturated than if I mix just the 2 colors that will make the most saturated orange, and those are listed in your assignment, so you won't get confused. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start out with a section that's in between 2 of the primaries. So yellow and red have yellow orange, orange, and red orange. But the first one I'm going to mix is going to be the orange, and I'm going to use the same process where I try to think about what the perfect orange would look like. And then I'll do the other 2 so that I can make sure they end up having nice even steps in between. So for orange, I'm going to use the warm yellow and the warm red. So I have brilliant yellow and flame red. The flame red's probably going to be a little stronger than the yellow, so I'm going to start with yellow and add a little bit of red until I find orange. Now I find this orange to be one of the harder ones because it's easy to make it too red. That looks pretty good. Now for yellow-orange, I can just add more yellow to this, and for red-orange, I can add more red to that. The goal is to make these steps feel like they're exactly in between. So yellow-orange shouldn't feel more yellow or more orange. It should really feel like it's right in between, and red-orange should also feel equidistant, so not more red or more orange. So I'm going to add more yellow to make the yellow orange. So what happens if you paint a color on and then you realize that it's not quite right? What you're going to do is just let it dry and then remix the color and paint it on top to correct it. So don't try to wipe it off or scrape it off. If you do it immediately, you might be able to get a little off, but it's more likely going to damage the paper, so it's best to just let it dry and then paint over it when you are ready to apply the right color. With this project as well, you'll have an opportunity to fix these colors a bit when you move on to step 2. So even if you realize that something isn't quite right in step 1, you can wait until the second part to correct it if you want to be efficient. Yellow, orange. Great, and then I'm going to do red, orange. I'm going to use this orange and just add a bit more red to it. Touch this up first. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the next section. So I'm going to do between yellow and blue. So the secondary color will be green, and the tertiary colors will be yellow-green and blue-green. And again, the pigments you should use for each of those as listed clearly in the assignment. I'm gonna do the last three, so I'm gonna do violet, blue violet, and red violet. So when you're finished, this is what the color wheel should look like for part one. It'll be just the outer ring, all the pure colors, and this is what you will submit on Canvas for peer feedback. And what I suggest is when you submit it that you ask your peers questions that you might have. So for example, do you think that my red needs more of the cool red added to it? Or do you think that my yellow-orange needs more yellow, that sort of thing. And as I mentioned before, if some of the colors are still a little bit streaky, you can either go ahead and add a second layer once they're dry now, or you can wait until you're working on part two, because you will have an opportunity to mix those colors again to do a second layer. So you could wait until you get the feedback if you'd like, but if you're more of a perfectionist and you want it all to be well presented now, I would go ahead and do a second coat on it now if you're confident that the colors are mixed well. So this is how to do part one. As I keep saying, this is a way to learn how to use the paint in addition to how to mix the colors. So it can be frustrating at times. Gouache is a little bit finicky in some ways because it's challenging to get it to be both flat and have the full saturation and body of the colors. So you'll get the hang of it as we go through this, and you'll be so much more equipped to handle the paint with the next project that we use it for.